so glad that so many of you are able to join. We're doing this because we're really hoping that this can just help give some helpful language. I know there's a lot of questions. We've been getting a lot of questions. And what's the history? And who are the Palestinians? And what's Hamas? And can I trust what I'm reading online? And there's all those questions. And many of you in this virtual room lead people of some kind. You're communicating to people, your pastors, your leaders. And I think it's so critical that we're intentional right now about being able to speak confidently about what's happening in Israel and Gaza, not shying away, and not just maybe saying what we can say to pacify the situation or speak peace to the situation, but also that we can speak truth in a loving way and help to counsel people that we lead through this very event. So
we think this is going to be just a continued conversation. So we want you guys to feel freedom to ask some of the harder questions that you may not have known who to ask or how to ask or when to ask. We've created this space as a safe space to be able to have some harder aspects of the conversation. And we may not know every answer, but we're willing to talk about it and address it and continue to see how the Lord leads us and to be able to serve in the way that we are here. And so we're so grateful for each one of you. You guys have been a big part of being able to help so many people here who are hurting and in need. And so we just wanted to say thank you for just joining with us and really helping so many people. And so we just want to really come alongside you and help give you language as you continue to lead people and help maybe answer some questions that others might have about what's going on. So let's open up in prayer. Dave, I'm going to ask you as our Californian, will you just open us up in prayer?
Great. I would love to. I'm unmuted. Here we go. Father, we just thank you for, I want to thank you for Michael and Vanessa and for the firm and the way you've elevated them in these days and all you're doing through our friends in Israel, right there in Jerusalem. God, I pray that you would give us all insight and wisdom in your heart and let your grace be on this conversation. We look to see your kingdom come both globally and especially right now in Israel. So speak to us and guide us. We love you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Well, first of all, we're going to record this, so we'll have the recording sent out as well. Thank you for those of you who joined live, but we're going to have the recording sent out as well. We hope it could be a tool for you to send to churches, to people on your staff, team, just as we're all leading people through what's happening right now. I'd love to make this interactive as well. And so there's not a lot of us on the call, which is great because we can be a little bit more intimate, interactive. Feel free to post questions in the chat and we'll answer those. I want to start by maybe giving just some high level questions, what we're seeing, what we're hearing online. And then I'd love to hear other questions from people in the room. And then I want to move to, how do we talk about this? How do we lead people through this? What should you say? What should you not say? How do we go about this? And so our goal is that you don't have to feel like you're walking on eggshells. We shouldn't feel like we're walking on eggshells. We should feel like people, men and women of God, that are filled with his word, filled with his spirit, can actually talk about and engage in conversations about what's happening, not out of fear, but out of a place of love. And as what the Bible tells us, as messengers of reconciliation. So, there's a couple questions. Obviously, I think what we've seen happen in the last 40 days, it's been 40 days right now since October the 7th. Obviously, on October the 7th, what happened was a massacre, a tragedy. I don't think there's a lot of disagreement there. There are some entities that have failed to condemn Hamas, but more or less around the world, I think people see what happened on that day as despicable, as a tragedy. I think for a lot of you pastors on October 8th, it was pretty easy to stand up on stage and say, pray for Israel, because the evil was so black and the innocence and the suffering was so clear. And just like any other catastrophe, any other disaster, any other hurricane around the world, you stand up and say, hey, we're praying for these people. And by and large, most of the people around the world were praying that first week. All of a sudden, that narrative has shifted. Over 40 days later, a lot of things haven't changed. There's still 1,200 dead civilians, a few hundred dead Israeli soldiers, and there's 240 or so hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. Only 3 of the hostages have been released, 2 released and 1 rescued. Another 2 have been found to be dead, but there's still 235 to 240 or so hostages in Gaza. As we're standing today, Israel has started a ground operation as of about 2.5 weeks ago, and has slowly been moving towards where they believe the headquarters of Hamas is. The U.S. has come out to say Hamas has been using hospitals and schools as places to hide weapons, places to launch rockets from, and now what we hear now is also Hamas headquarters. So this hospital, the Shifa hospital in Gaza City, just in the last 24 hours, Israel has now been doing operations inside of the hospital. And unfortunately, what it looks like is that most of the Hamas leadership has already fled. It looks like there were hostages that were kept there, but now they're not. So were they moved? Did they get moved to the south? There's a lot of questions around that. I think a lot of the optimism in the country around maybe this is going to be a shorter conflict and longer was feeling like Israel was making progress towards its headquarters, and now that's it's looking like we have a lot more work to do. So from the narrative online and probably in your churches, it's becoming harder and harder and harder to say pray for Israel, especially when images fill the screen of Palestinians who are dying, children who are dying, when you hear things like hospitals and churches have been hit in air raids. So it could be very, very challenging. How do we talk about this? How do we talk about both sides? What does that look like, both sides? Who are the Palestinians? Where did they get the name Palestinians? Are they descendants of the Philistines? Where does that idea come from? Who is Hamas? So we wanted to answer some of those questions today. I want to start by answering the question, who is Hamas? I think that's an important place to start. Hamas is a word in Hebrew, it means violence. But in Arabic, Hamas is a word that it's an acronym, stands for the Islamic, basically like the version of the Islamic State, really wanting to see Islamic law govern all aspects of society. They were started in 1987. The charter of Hamas was published in 1988, and they were an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt. And when they started, in their very charter, they call for the destruction, the annihilation of Israel. I said, I can quote, I think by heart, this charter that says Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam eradicates, wipes it out completely. And so these are things in the Hamas charter. Now, they didn't start with as much power as they have right now. They started as a terrorist organization, as a terrorist group, writing off the intifadas, gaining traction after the Oslo Accords. We'll talk a little bit about what the Oslo Accords are. So as there's peace deals trying to be made, Hamas is growing in popularity, growing in power as an extremist movement. Really, I think Hamas was created to maybe balance out some of the more centrist Palestinian groups. So the other Palestinian party, if you call it that, would be Fatah. Fatah. So Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO. These are all languages around what was once a terrorist organization. Depending on who you talk to now, might still be considered that, but they really normalized, and they're the ones who are the current Palestinian Authority of today. These guys are the ones who have taken over the party from Yasser Arafat, and they are currently the governing party in the West Bank. So Hamas started as the PLO, moved away from extremism to a little bit more public consumption, has a little bit more relationships in the political sphere. Hamas began as a more violent, more extremist, more jihadist expression. And until where we get to today, where Hamas is now in power in Gaza. Now, how do we get to the understanding of Hamas in Gaza? How did Hamas come to power in Gaza? What is the Gaza Strip? How does that even work? I want to share a little bit of the history of this. So many of us talk right now, and the challenge about talking about this conflict is if you say, well, what happened on October 7th was so catastrophic, what people say Yes, we don't endorse violence of any kind, but you got to look at the context. You got to look at the context. And the context is that Israel has been occupying land. And so these people that are responding, they really have no choice. They're responding violently. They shouldn't do that, but they're responding violently because Israel's making them respond violently. And it becomes this narrative of where did it begin? Who committed the first crime? Who was here first? And that's a common cultural trait of this region. It's like land is so valuable, and land is not just a property like from a Western mindset that we think that can be exchanged. Land is territory. It's my home. It's my family. I'm gonna stay in this land. And so the question goes: did Israel steal land from the Arabs? Is the land rightfully from the Arabs? Did Arabs steal land from Israel? Whose land does it belong to? Whose land does God say it belongs to? This is the ever-present debate, and that becomes the justification for what's happening. So it can probably feel as a pastor like, man, we can have a really circular conversation. Let me try to give an abbreviated history of the last 75 years of what's happened, or maybe the last 100 years or so of what's happened in this region of the world. Most people know that this land that we're in today, we're here in Jerusalem, the land we're in today was occupied by Jewish people since the first millennium, 1,000 years, 10th century BC. Some even predate that, but we know King David was here in 1000 BC. We have archaeological proof. We have historical proof. There's no question. There are people that try to discredit this. Even some of the agencies and committees of the UN have challenged whether this is a UNESCO heritage site for Jewish people, Jerusalem. But really, you have to be doing mental gymnastics to say that the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were not here. Some say as far back as 1500 BC, but definitely in 1000 BC, we know King David was here. The archaeological proof is undeniable. Fast forward to Jesus's day, and after Jesus dies, raises from the dead, and ascends, we have the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The Romans are the occupying power of Jerusalem, of Israel in that day. Ever since Israel returns from the Babylonian exile, they're exiled in 586 BC. Ever since they return from the Babylonian exile, they're governed by other people, whether it's the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Israel is a state that's not a state. It's under the empire, another empire. Well, fast forward to 135 AD, and here's why this is important, is because in 135 AD, there was a revolt. There was a revolt by the Jews to try to get the Romans off their back. The temple was already destroyed. And the Romans, in order to squash the revolt, they changed the name of this entire region. They changed the name from Israel, and they changed the name to Palestina. That's the first term where we get the language Palestine or Palestina is the Romans who changed the name from Israel to Palestina in order to be a slap in the face to the Jews, and they name it after the Jews, the Israelites' mortal enemy, the Philistines. And so Palestina was a name given to this region, not a name given to a country. It was a name given to this region in 135 AD by the Romans as an assault or an affront to the Jews to say, this is no longer Israel, this is no longer your land. Now, the people living in this region became known at some point throughout history as Palestinians, but this was a region. Fast forward, you have the Byzantines, you have the Crusaders, you have the Ottomans. So from about the 14th century, 15th century till the beginning of the 20th century, you have the Ottomans that were in power in this area. Again, the region was still Palestina, but this was the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, possession of this land, this region, goes from the Ottomans to the British. And the British now control this territory as part of the British Empire. And they call this the British Mandate of Palestine. Again, the region is Palestina. It was much larger than this region. It included the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. It also included most of what's now the country of Jordan. It was a large region. But people that were living in the British Mandate of Palestine were known as Palestinians. But the Palestinian identity was an Arab identity and a Jewish identity. It was anyone that was living in this region. It would like me being say, if you live in North America, you are North American. It didn't develop into the national identity that it is today, with a flag, with all that, until much, much later. We get to the early 1920s, and when the British had possession of this land in 1917, there was also a declaration called the Balfour Declaration, where in the UK, in Great Britain, they said there needs to be a homeland for the Jewish people. It should be somewhere in this region with their native homeland, where we know they were 3,000 years ago, and there should be a land for the Jewish people. That's in 1917. Nothing happened on that for 30 years, but there was a declaration, there was an intention. Now we get to the early 1920s. We have the Hussein family from what is now modern day Jordan, but the Hussein family, a wealthy Arab family, had an issue with the idea of partitioning a plot of land for the Jews. And so Britain made a deal with Jordan and gave Jordan sovereignty, all the lands across the Jordan River. In fact, one of the British prime ministers, drew a line basically down the Jordan River and said, everything to the east, this will become a new Arab state. We're going to give it to the Hussein family, and it's going to become the country of Jordan. So what I'm trying to show is that was land that was part of Palestina. It was given to Jordan. There was also other land that became part of Egypt. And so this region, there was still this land that was what was the British Mandate of Palestine. Now we get to the end of World War II, the end of 1945. Obviously, 6 million Jews killed, massacred in the Holocaust. Jews from all over Europe, all over the world were displaced, were looking for a homeland. There was still the Balfour Declaration saying there should be a homeland here. And the British decided, we are going to pull out of this area of the British Mandate of Palestine. And that was given over to the United Nations, that made a proclamation, made a plan called the United Nations Plan for the Partition of what would become Israel and Palestine. They wanted to create two states, a Jewish state in the region, an Arab state in the region, with a shared capital, an international city in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was going to be an international city, a capital. There would be a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now the Jews, post-World War II, thought, this is great. We need a state. It's our land. Let's say yes. The Jews accepted the deal. They didn't really have any other choice. The Arabs, however, that were living in the land said, no, we don't. We reject the plan. This was November 29th, 1947. So 6 months later, the British, even though the Arabs rejected the plan, the British still decided to pull out. They pulled out all their troops. Most of the believers in the land even left at this point, and the British completely pulled out, and Israel declared independence in Tel Aviv on May 14th, 1948. On the day that Israel declares independence, Israel is attacked by 5 other Arab states all around. Again, to paint the context of the greater Middle East, we have 22 Arab states. We have 54 Muslim states all around in this little tiny plot of land. The one Jewish state that was supposed to exist here all of a sudden gets attacked. The one-day-old country gets attacked by five Arab countries, by Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt and Iraq. And everyone thinks this is going to be another Holocaust. But miraculously, this war is fought over the next 6 months. It's called the War of Independence. But this war, Israel ends the war, and there are borders set for what becomes known as the country, the nation of Israel. Now, where is Palestine, or where are the Palestinians in all of this? When the borders settle after the war in 1948, Israel as a country, a lot of Palestinians did have to leave their homes that were in what now is Israel. We'll talk about that in a second. But where was Palestine in 1948, 1949, 1950? Well, all of what today people would describe as Palestinian territory, they might describe as Palestine, was in 1948, 49, 50. It was Jordan, the country of Jordan, the western bank of the Jordan River. That's why we call it the West Bank. That was Jordan's territory after the war. The Golan Heights was Syrian territory. Egypt controlled Gaza. And so you had other countries, real countries with national borders that existed with Palestinian refugees that were dwelling there. What happened in 1948, I mean, so much goes back to 1948 because for Israel, this is our war of independence. This is the day Israel became a nation. This is, wow, out of the ashes of the Holocaust, this miraculous thing. God promised us this land. We returned to the land. God did a miracle. We're back in the land for the first time in almost 2,000 years. And yet, for most Palestinians, this day, May 14, 1948, is known as the Nakba, which is the catastrophe. It's known as a day of pain. You can imagine the tension on our Independence Day. And one half of Jerusalem, there's celebration and there's rejoicing. On the other side, people are remembering the pain of what happened. And you can imagine traumatized Jewish people just having been massacred in the Holocaust coming. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of hurt, and not everything was done perfectly. Sometimes there were Arabs that were told, leave your homes. They were told by Arabs to leave their homes. We're going to wipe out the Jews and then you can return back. And then at the end of the war, they're stuck in Lebanon or they're stuck in the West Bank with no status, no citizenship in a refugee camp. Some were actually removed from their homes by Jews. And so you have this pain that was created in 1948 that we're still seeing the ripple effects of that pain 75 years later today. So after 1948, the next major event is 1967. Fast forward 19 years, and we are now in early June of 1967. There's an Egyptian president named Nasser, and he hates Israel, hates the Jewish people. He gets an alliance of Arab countries to declare war on Israel. Now, before they declare war, they're getting ready for an attack. Israel makes a preemptive strike. Beginning of June 1967, Israel sends 97% of their air force to do a preemptive strike on the Egyptian air fleet. It was a gutsy move. It could have failed. If they failed, it would have meant the ending of Israel. And somehow they succeed. And in 6 days, Israel miraculously, as the underdog, defeats all these other Arab countries. And not only that, they take land. We take the entire Sinai Peninsula. We take all of the West Bank of the Jordan River from Jordan, all of East Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, that was a city divided in two, now becomes one unified city, and all of the Golan Heights from Syria and Gaza as well. So all of that land, now Israel's more than doubled in size in 6 days. It was a miraculous victory. Again, no one thought this would happen. Ever since that war in 1967, Israel has tried to trade land for peace. So in the 70s, we signed a peace treaty with Egypt. We said, we'll give you back the Sinai. We'll give you back the Sinai Peninsula. You take it. That's a lot of land, a lot of land. You take the Sinai. We just want a peace deal. So we signed a peace deal with Egypt. We also signed a peace deal with Jordan. Syria and Lebanon are not very interested in signing peace deals with us. So Syria and Libya and Lebanon are definitely still enemy states. For the last 10, 15 years, Syria has had their own civil war. And so there hasn't been really a clear enemy on that side. But in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah, which is, if Hamas is bad, Hezbollah is about 10 times worse. They gathered on the northern border. They have 150,000 missiles that can reach all the way to the very southern tip of Israel. They have 5,000 precision rockets. We're talking about these guys put Hamas to shame if they were to launch an all-out war. So that's the Lebanese border. But the question is, what about the Palestinians? And most of the Palestinians live in two areas: the West Bank, which is everything from East Jerusalem, Judea, biblical Judea and Samaria, where most of these Bible stories happen, where we read about the Samaritans, we read about Bethel, we read about Jacob, the Judean hills, the Judea and Samaria, and this strip called Gaza. These are two territories where the major populations of the Palestinians were. And these territories, while they were won by Israel in 1967, their status has been up in the air. Israel has not annexed that population because Israel's in a conundrum. If we annex Gaza and the West Bank, these people that don't want to be our citizens, they don't like us, they want to kill us, well, we have a problem. How can we be both a democracy and a Jewish state? If we have more Muslims than we have Jews, well, now all of a sudden we either give up being a democracy or we give up being Jewish and we have yet another Arab state in the Middle East. So Israel has not annexed the West Bank, hasn't annexed Gaza, but there has been this conundrum. This is where you hear two-state solution. Ever since 1967, there's wanted to be a peace deal. So we need a two-state solution. We need a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. The challenge is, do you have partners that really do want two states? Do you have partners that want to accept Israel's right to exist? Or do you have partners that say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? The challenge with that very statement, that's challenge with that very statement is, what do you mean? Well, the river is the Jordan River. That's our eastern border. And the sea is the Mediterranean Sea. That's our western border. So if you're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, you're asking for a world where Israel does not exist, where we push the Jews into the sea, which is what was said in 1948. And so while there's been lots of talk about a two-state solution and many different efforts towards this, the last peace agreement that's held is something called the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords was a step towards this two-state solution. It said, let's partition the West Bank into three areas, three zones: Zone A, B, and C. Zone C is going to be totally Israel-controlled militarily and civilly. If you're in Israel, you drive to the Dead Sea, you're on major highway roads, you're in Zone C. Zone B are going to be Palestinian Arab communities within the West Bank. We're going to have Israel provide the security apparatus, but the Palestinian Authority, which is the PLO, Fatah, the former terrorist organization that's kind of become mainstream, we're going to let the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, govern civilly in these Territory B areas. And then in Territory or Zone A, we're going to completely remove all Israelis, all Jews. We're going to give it completely over to the Palestinian Authority, both for security and for governance. And these are areas like Bethlehem, Jericho, Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, cities that are completely controlled both security-wise and civilly by the Palestinian Authority. This was an agreement in Oslo, Norway in 1993. It was a step towards normalization. It was a step towards this two-state solution. And that, to this day, 30 years ago, that's the most sophisticated peace arrangement we have that still stands to this day. Now, it's a challenge. Is it effective? How do you have peace if you can't actually go and be with the other people? So right now, as an Israeli citizen, we're not allowed to go into those Territory A areas. This becomes a little challenging when people start talking about the Israeli occupation. This is a question I wrote down as something that I've been asked. What is this Israeli occupation? Well, what people are talking about is what happened after 1967. They might be talking about what happened after 1948, so you really have to ask them for clarity. In 1948, most people would agree what became Israel proper was not an occupation, because Israel became a country. Anyone that lived in those areas became a citizen of Israel. In 1967, Israel again had this problem. They couldn't annex Gaza and the West Bank, nor did they want to annex it. They were looking for peace. They didn't really have a partner for peace, which is why we have this Oslo Accord agreement that we have today. And so when people talk about the Israeli occupation, they're looking at what is Israel doing in the West Bank and what is Israel doing in Gaza. Now, the West Bank, again, there are cities in the West Bank that Israel doesn't touch. Bethlehem, Ramallah, Jericho, the major population cores where over 50% of the Palestinian population lives are Territory A. They're not being occupied by Israel. But while they're not being occupied, they're also not another country. These people don't have passports. They have a challenge with movement. Jordan hasn't been particularly nice to these people. I mean, you got to think, these people lived in the country of Jordan for 19 years, and Jordan never gave them citizenship. No one's condemning Jordan for not giving them citizenship, but they maintained a refugee status. They passed it down generationally, and now we have a problem that was 500,000 refugees in 1948. Now we have that's over 5-6 million Palestinian refugees today. So we have a perpetuating problem. Now, what happened with Gaza? Okay, so we know we have the West Bank. We understand we have these different territories. We kind of have this cold peace right now. They're not their own state. They're not autonomous. So Israel provides power. Israel provides water. Israel collects tax dollars and pays the Palestinian Authority. So the Israel and Palestinian Authority, even though they're not having a functional talking relationship when it comes to peace deals, there is a functioning relationship when it comes to just logistically governing a society. So we get to the end of 1999, 2000, where kind of the famous Bill Clinton is president, and you have Yasser Arafat, an Israeli prime minister, about to sign a peace agreement. They were giving the Palestinians 98% of the land they wanted. At the very last minute, Yasser Arafat pulls out as the negotiating party for the Palestinians, saying, I don't want to be the Palestinian president that gave up Jerusalem. So that was the sticky point, Jerusalem. And I'm telling you, any of us that are really hoping for a two-state solution, this may not be politically correct, the biggest challenge is going to be Jerusalem. Israel annexed Jerusalem. The Arabs in East Jerusalem became Israeli citizens or were offered Israeli citizenship. And Israel's not giving up Jerusalem from being what we call our eternal and undivided capital. So if the Palestinians are unwilling to budge on that, and the Jews are willing to unbudge on that, I don't know how it's possible to have a two-state solution with that being a non-negotiable for both parties. That is the huge challenge. So after that rejection of the peace process, we kicked into what was the second intifada. An intifada is an Arabic word that means uprising. This uprising took place from the year 2000, 2005. This is when there were suicide bombings all over Israel. In Jerusalem, you had buses blowing up. We had over 500 suicide bombings a year happening. And this is when Israel reluctantly built what is now known as a security barrier between the West Bank and Israel. So if you were to go to Bethlehem, some of you have seen the big wall. You see this picture. It's like apartheid. It's ethnic cleansing. Well, the wall was only built in response to hundreds and hundreds of suicide bombings that were happening. And for those who say the wall wasn't effective, well, now we have 0 suicide bombings happening every year. And even if we do have terrorist attacks, they're not suicide bombings. So this has been effective. The security barrier runs all the way along the perimeter from the West Bank through Israel, all the way from the south by the Dead Sea area, all the way up north into modern day Samaria. But most of it is just a fence. At certain areas where it's heightened security, you have the big wall. Obviously, that's the images that make it online, these big walls. Less than 4% of the fence is this wall, but it's only these high security, high risk areas that have that. But regardless, we have a system where we drive through checkpoints. It's incredibly difficult for our friends, even our Christian brothers and sisters that are in Bethlehem that don't have Israeli citizenship, to come into Israel. For them, it's like coming into another country. It's a challenge for them to get to Jordan. It's a challenge for them to travel. They don't have passports. Really, the Palestinians are in an incredible predicament. So much support money has been given to them. There's been more money given to the Palestinians as aid than all of the money that was given to Europe to recover from World War II, over 20 times over.
Wow.
And so where has that money gone? Well, unfortunately, a lot of the Palestinian leadership is quite corrupt. After Yasser Arafat died, they found billions of dollars in offshore bank accounts. So you see a little bit of what this problem is. And really, it's not in the interest of the Palestinian leadership to have peace, because the presence of the conflict provides ample financing for themselves. And the Palestinian Authority, I have no problem saying, it's a very corrupt government. They've not had an election in almost 20 years. They keep just postponing the elections so the governing party stays in power. And honestly, it's probably better than they're in power than Hamas. So you have this predicament. Now where do we get to Gaza? Well, this is what I want to talk about, Gaza, and then we'll open up for some other questions here. Gaza is very important. So when people tell me, well, the Israeli occupation is the problem, and Israel needs to end its occupation in Gaza, my response to them is do you know history? Because Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Very controversial in Israel. Probably most Israelis would have said this was not the right thing to do. But our Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, decided, it's called the disengagement of Gaza, in 2005. At the end of this intifada, they thought, well, if we simply give them land and we give them prime real estate, then there'll be peace. So we're going to pull out. We're going to pull out all the Jewish communities, tens of thousands of Jews living in communities in the Gaza. We're going to pull them out. We're going to rip them from their homes. We're going to give the Palestinians Gaza. We're going to give them self-governance. We're going to give them autonomy. We're going to provide them infrastructure. We're going to give them businesses, greenhouses, homes. And we're going to pull out in the effort of peace. Very, very controversial. So Israel completely pulls out of Gaza, not like the West Bank, completely pulls out in 2005. What happens? In 2006, the Palestinians in the West Bank elect Hamas to be the governing party. In 2007, Hamas brutally assassinates and wipes out all the other parties, which is the PLO or Fatah, the other more nominal party. They assassinate the other party. And by 2008, they start sending rockets and building terror tunnels into Israel. So what was this gesture of peace on behalf of Israel? Hey, we're going to give you your own land. It's right on the Mediterranean. You could turn it into an economic tourist destination. All of a sudden, all of that support and relief money goes to rockets and weapons. Now, Hamas has built, in the last 17 years, Hamas has built 500 kilometers, 300 miles of terror tunnels, some 70 meters. That's like 200 feet below the Earth's surface. The UN put in infrastructure for water. Hamas dug up the pipes, turned it into rockets. So this has been a problem. And now since 2007, so for the last 16, 17 years, Israel has dealt with every 2 to 3 years, Hamas starts firing rockets, starts either digging terror tunnels or sending terrorists through the terror tunnels. And every few years, Israel has to have an operation where they hit Hamas, they try to demolish their military standpoints, but then the problem perpetuates. And what happened on October 7th is that Israel's policy of deterrent, Israel's policy of tolerance, of coexisting with a terrorist entity at your doorpost, all of a sudden that policy went out the window. No longer can we live with tolerance when in an instant, in a moment, overnight, 3,000 Hamas terrorists can come into the country, kill babies, children, take hostages, wreak havoc, all in a 72-hour period. So that gives a little bit of the history and a little bit of the grief about what we're experiencing now in Gaza. This is a sad state. Gaza is a peace process gone bad. Gaza was a piece of land given to Palestinians, taken over by a radical Islamic group with radical ideology that wants to wipe out Israel. And they're not just a terrorist organization. They're a terrorist organization and they're a government. That means they're controlling the Ministry of Education. They're controlling what kids are getting taught. They're controlling your social welfare services. They're controlling everything. So when we start talking about who are the Palestinians and how do we feel about innocent Palestinians, the best example I can compare is what would you do with Germans that were living in Germany with Nazis in control? The Nazis were not just a military, they were also a political force. It was also an ideology. So some are radical, some might be in support of the radical because they were raised in that system with that education, and some might not be radical, but to speak out against the radicals is a death warrant for you and your family. So this is the predicament that the 2 million people in Gaza currently face. And so what we're experiencing right now is this conundrum. As Israel looks at Gaza and decides to engage in Gaza, what happened on October 7th was unprecedented. It was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It's worse than any other war that we've had in terms of civilians killed and in as brutal of a manner as they were killed. So Israel's now committed. We've got to go in and dismantle Hamas. That doesn't leave a lot of good alternatives. Who's going to govern Gaza afterwards? There's no real good answer for that. But we cannot tolerate having a terrorist organization govern. And that terrorist organization is neither good for Israel, nor is it good for the Palestinians. So I hope that answers a little bit of the history of Hamas. When we talk about the Israeli occupation, what are we talking about with Gaza? There really isn't an occupation. I mean, maybe you could say since October 7th, there's an occupation, but that's because Israel's moved in after being attacked by 3,000 people, terrorists. Does Israel let humanitarian aid into Gaza? I think this is very important. Israel lets humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel provides the water, the electricity, the telecommunication support for most of Gaza. Again, they're not an independent state. They don't have their own infrastructure. Israel provides most of that. After October 7th, Israel did cut off a good amount of humanitarian aid for a season because they understood it was hard to get humanitarian aid to the people that needed it without it going to terrorists and funding Hamas. So this is a predicament. It really doesn't look good from a PR image in the world standpoint, but Israel has been burned multiple times. Every time Israel caves and gives humanitarian support, which I'm in favor of Israel giving humanitarian support. Every time it caves, we find out Palestinian Hamas terrorists have fled from Gaza, or Palestinians have killed the truck driver and they've stolen the goods, they've stolen the fuel. And what's a true narrative? What's a not true narrative? And a lot of what we're facing right now is this battle with the media online of these images that we're seeing. What's true? What's not true? What's manipulation? What's Israel? And it becomes a real challenge for so many of us who are trying to lead and pastor our people through what's happening. So I'd like to just open it up for questions. I've shared a lot on the history. I'd like to open up for any questions regarding the history, regarding the situation, anything that we can answer.
While you're thinking of your questions, I just want to add in here, it's a extremely complicated situation, and Michael giving the history is so important to understand how things started and how things developed over time and why we're at the place that we're at today. And I think just being here on the ground, knowing what's going out in the news around the world, the reality of what's happening here is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for the state of Israel and the Jewish people, but it's also heartbreaking for those who are in Gaza and who are in the West Bank. And it's a very, very difficult reality that, sometimes when you look at it and you think like, well, there's got to be just one way, one right way. And there's, Israel's not perfect, but in the amount of times and efforts that we have tried, there's a reality of what do you expect us to do? How do you expect us to respond? We need to be able to protect ourselves. But it's so complicated, and there are so many hurting people. And I think one of the major things that has been something that's been important for us to say, because we have friends that are Palestinian Christians, we have friends who are Arab Christians, and they really need to hear that they're not second-class citizens, that they are not left out of the love of God, that God loves them and wants and has a heart for them and a purpose for them, just like he does for all of us. And so that's something that we want to be able to be a voice of hope for them as well, because they're in a horrible situation as well. And if we can join together and be against Hamas, because Hamas is the one who is hindering them from having the freedom and the life that God could have for them. So, there's just so much with it, but we just wanted to open up and give the history and answer some of the harder questions because it's so complicated.
Thank you for that.
Sure, I understand.
Okay, Diane, you got a question for us?
Yes, good morning from California. I'm in Antioch, so good to see you guys.
It's Diana.
It's more like
Diana.
okay. It's more like a statement. I understand a lot because of my cultural context. Corruption in government is pretty much across the board in a lot of my Latin American countries, which I'm associated with. And so what the statement that I want to make is this, is that I know all of this. And I know you need to know that you have friends in us. And in the same token, I think for people across the board in the US, the cultural conditioning of jihad is very real. Government, as Christians are going into the 7 spheres, so is extremist Islam. And if you can explain that a little bit more for the listeners that are joining in on this call, I think it would explain a lot in how they perceive education, government, how they perceive pretty much a strategic mood, a plan, and how they approach the conditioning of Palestinians and how to view it, because it's over here in the US as well. There's a cultural conditioning in universities, and that's what you're seeing on the streets. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, some of this is getting into, what does radical Islam teach? And the elimination of Jews is just the beginning of that. It would be an entire society that is under Islamic law. I mean, we saw maybe some of the brutal extent of this with ISIS. ISIS was the Islamic State, and it was trying to have an entire state governed under Sharia law and what that would look like. It's interesting that you have a lot of young college students. I saw a lot of like LGBTQ college students that are in favor of Palestinians because, right after Jews and Christians, you have probably on their list of people to rid the world of would be LGBTQ and would be feminist and would be other people that are different outside of the bounds of Islam. And I think what's important to realize is what we're actually facing is a regional conflict. So we can zoom into Israel and Gaza, but if you want to zoom out to the region, where do the power dynamics in the Middle East lie? Well, probably two of the largest countries, most powerful countries in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they represent these two different ideologies, Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. And what you have in Iran, ever since radical Islam has taken over Iran in the late 70s, what you have in Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. So what we don't have is we don't have countries fighting against countries. We have Iran funding and backing terrorist organizations. So Hamas is completely funded by Iran. Hezbollah, completely funded by Iran. The Houthis in Yemen, completely funded by Iran. And yet at the same time, why the timing of October 7th, I believe a big part of it was Israel was very close to signing a peace normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. Very close. And as soon as all this happens, it was just like a footnote in one of the news sources. But the Saudi Arabia said we're not talking about normalizing with Israel right now. And so that's obviously if you were Iran and Saudi Arabia are kind of enemies. They're both Arabs, so they get along in some areas, but really they represent two different ideologies. With Saudi Arabia having a little bit more Western connection than Iran would have. It's interesting what you see happen. Just a week and a half ago, you had all of the Arab countries, 54 Muslim nations, heads of state gathered in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia to discuss what was happening with Israel and the Palestinians, and they condemned it. Obviously, they would condemn it. They would say, we need to fight for the Palestinians. But you see other agencies such as the Syrians and the Lebanese starting to get activated. I see the question here, what's the likelihood of Hezbollah joining the war? Really, this war is between Iran and Israel. It's just being fought through proxies. And the closest proxy is Hamas. It may stay that. If we, I think our prayer would be that it doesn't escalate beyond that. If you ask me my opinion, I would say there is a large, high probability that it will escalate beyond that. Already what's happening between Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Israel, people are dying, civilians were killed, rockets are being fired. The people in the north of Israel cannot live there. And Israel has a predicament. We can't afford for the majority of our country in the north not to be able to feel safe in their own homes. And so I'm expecting some escalation from Hezbollah, not because I want that, but because I think we have to prepare for that. I think we're going to prepare that it would be a multi-front war. Probably the only reason Hezbollah has not attacked yet is because the U.S. has a couple aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean right now, which is helpful. Other than that, I think Hezbollah would have attacked. And then the question is, what about Iran? What about other proxies like the Houthis, etc.? So we can look at Gaza and the Palestinians, and you better believe anything that happens with the other countries, it's going to be about what's happening in Gaza. It's going to be, things are on the hair of on a razor's edge right now. One rocket from Lebanon that hits a home and kills 10 Israelis. One misfired attack in Gaza where civilians die. We're one step away from other fronts in this war happening, and everyone's really positioned and heightened their sense of alarm. So thanks for that, Diana. I know, Diana, I took that a little bit off, but I think what we're seeing is not just Hamas and for the poor Palestinians, we're seeing the Palestinians being used as a way to rally the world to support what is Iran believing in absolutely wiping out Israel's existence. And Iran would also want to wipe out most of what Western ideology and Judeo-Christian values stands for. Other questions? I'd love to get a little practical with the few minutes we have left, and just hear, are there challenges? How do we talk about this from the pulpit? How do we engage in this? I want to do humanitarian support work in Israel. Is there stuff in Gaza? Like, I'd love to help get practical in the last few minutes we have here. Any questions on that sense? How do we talk about this, Miles?
Yeah, I have a practical and theoretical question, which is Goebbels taught Hitler that if you tell a lie, big lie long enough, people will believe it. How can we as this remnant do a better job of combating the incredible, emotionally fired ignorance that is sweeping through the world? Any thoughts about, I mean, we're all doing what we know how to do so far, but any ideas about how we can increase our effectiveness in pushing back against the narrative that's sweeping the world right now?
Yeah, that's really good, Miles. I'll give some thoughts on this. I think what we're experiencing today is that information and news is so polarized. People are listening to the people that they agree with. And so it's so hard to have an intelligent conversation or engage with someone who believes something different. And many of us just feel like maybe there's nothing we can do. I believe if we're going to engage, some of the mistakes that are made are people that love Israel sometimes can come across uncompassionate towards what's happening to Palestinians. They can come across maybe a little bit black and white, like, well, the Bible says they're God's chosen people, so we're going to support them. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's helpful at all in terms of talking about this, because the way I would look at it is God chose King David, God chose Abraham. Just because God chose someone, one, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, so that's not going to change, but doesn't mean those people don't make mistakes. Abraham made some mistakes. David made some mistakes. And so I think we have to be careful how we talk. As I've talked to Palestinian Christian friends, I realize often they are treated by evangelical Christians in America like, and I've had people say this to me, partners say this to us, why doesn't Israel just wipe out the Gaza, start afresh? And when you say stuff like that, it comes across very ignorant, because there are civilians. Hamas is using the civilians as not just human shields, but as a way to garner support from the rest of the world. So there are civilians. We have to talk about it. We can't just say, yes, we care about the pain on both sides. We have to really, really show true empathy and true compassion. And my message that I say to Palestinian Christians is, you're not second rate. You're not second best. Just because you're not the chosen people doesn't mean your life is worth any less, or the fact that your freedom, your justice, your decent human rights should not be fought for. But then I think we need to see our Palestinian Christian friends, see them, show compassion, show empathy. At the same time, I would call them to say, let's partner together as for me, as an Israeli Messianic Jew and as a Christian Palestinian, let's partner together to abhor what's truly evil. Can we agree that Hamas is evil, that Hamas is causing a negative life for both Palestinians and for Israelis, and that the world would get better without Hamas? And if we try to find areas of commonality, I think that can help us. I think as we're able to show compassion, we have to be careful, because the poor way of showing compassion is to do what I call the easy cop-out, where we say, well, we just honor the innocent on both sides. The challenge with that is, just imagine after 9/11. Imagine after 9/11, the president stands up and says, man, we're so sorry about what happened in New York, and we just want to honor that. We know there's casualties on both sides. It would feel totally devoid of any sense, because what it does is it creates an equivalence between the two. So I'm saying two things. I'm saying I think we have to see and care and show compassion for Palestinians. I think we need to separate Palestinians from Hamas and make sure in our language and the way we're talking about it that we're separating. At the same time, I don't think we should create a moral equivalence where we say, well, we just need to pray for an end to the fighting. This is a little problematic, and maybe this might be a little controversial. The problem with praying for an end to the fighting is we may be just praying for a Band-Aid instead of a solution. And I think as believers, we should be praying for a solution, for true justice, for true righteousness, not just for a ceasefire. We've had 9 ceasefires. The most recent ceasefire we had with Gaza was on October 6th. It was broken on October 7th. So is a ceasefire going to help us if we can have October 7th happen all over again in 2 years or in 3 years or in 10 years? A ceasefire is not the answer. And so what is the answer? We can all disagree on the political solutions of what the specifics of the answer are, but I think it's very important that we're praying for true peace, true justice, and we're praying with an understanding that some of this conflict is not going to go away without Yeshua showing up in a radical way and changing the hearts of both Jews and Muslims. So some of that's not going to go away. I'll just share this short point. You know, these people that lived along the Gaza border, the people that were attacked, many of them were very sympathetic and loving towards the Palestinians in Gaza. I met with one community. They said, we were born in Gaza. We were raised in Gaza. We left. We were the optimistic ones that left in 2005. We started a new community. This one lady said, I used to bring food and money to the fence to give to my Palestinian friends. And that's the same fence that Hamas broke down, and they came and they killed our kids. So when this happens, it creates bitterness. It creates a web of hatred. Israel had let up 10,000 Palestinians from Gaza into the country for jobs. And in Israel, they're paid 3.5 times better than they're paid in the average wage in Gaza. Now that's all gone. Those people have lost their livelihoods because of an attack by a radical Islamic group. And so I think it's just so important that we show compassion, we show empathy. We should not be shy in the face of suffering to acknowledge that people are hurting. At the same time, what I caution people, especially young people, in your effort and your desire to show compassion, be careful lest you partner with a spirit, I would say even a demonic spirit, that is willing for the annihilation of another people. Yeah. And that's where we have to be careful. We want to show compassion, but we don't want to get to a point where we're partnering with a spirit that is saying, gas the Jews, burn the Jews, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, the elimination of the Jews. That needs to be seen as the wicked evil that it is, as a spirit that goes back all the way to the book of Genesis, that we can see in Haman, in the story of Esther and Mordecai in Persia. You know, we have modern day Iran. This all happened with Haman, the Agagite. And then we have it happen with Hitler. We have this happen again. It's a different generation, different form, but it's the same spirit. So that's how I would coach our young people. Is it's great that we want to have compassion. We should have compassion, and we should find ways of helping and loving and caring. At the same time, we're not praying for a Band-Aid solution so we can all feel good on our social media. We're praying for true justice, true peace, true righteousness. And sometimes that means eliminating an evil regime. And if we as Palestinian Christians and Jewish Israelis can agree that that needs to be something we eliminate, then I think we'd be better for it. Yes, Diana, you said Hamas are the freedom fighters liberating the Palestinians. Again, this is the challenge with this conversation, is that, you know, people can then start to excuse and say, well, Palestinians are justified because they're living under an occupation. I honestly think there's an importance for truth and truth being spoken. I think it's hard when you're getting into an argument of what started first. Well, Palestinians have been here hundreds of years. Oh, no, well, Jews have been here longer. Oh, when you start arguing that way, it's hard. And so for us as spiritual leaders, I think it's very, very important that we're highlighting the spiritual dynamics of this battle. That we don't wage war against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities in the heavenly realms. And what we're seeing is nothing short of a spiritual dynamic. This would not happen in another area of the world, such a polarized global outlook. And so I think as we're pointing people towards that, we're saying, hey, we want to have compassion, empathy, but we also want to be a voice for truth. That's something we'd be praying for. Miles?
Michael, I just, last week I had Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch on my podcast, and I was able to give him a gift that I didn't think I'd ever give someone of his stature. However, I learned this 20 years ago from a PLO terrorist who got saved. And he told me to help me to understand. He said, think of the occupation as the occupation of young Arab minds, because what we're seeing is the fruit of that training and that inculcation that is just filled with hatred from the radical Islamist ideology that these governments, so-called, are inculcating these kids with. And so when I hear the word occupation, I don't think about territory. It's like look at a map and see Israel compared to, you know, the Muslim world surrounding it. It's absurd. It's not about land, but the occupation of the mind and hate, that's what needs to change. That's what has to happen. Now, how we each communicate that in our spheres is up to us to find that from the Lord. But I feel like that's a safety zone for me, is, the training and the education and the, speaking about that in turn, rather than speaking about land per se. I don't know if that helps.
Michael, I had a quick question if
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Chris Russo from Riverland Church in South Carolina. So if I was, because I want to pray in line with you guys. If I was with you in your time of prayer, what are the things? I mean, and you've answered this a little bit, maybe to the full extent already, for a true solution. What are you praying for right now that we can really join you in?
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. I think number one, we're praying for freedom for these hostages. The fact that 40 days they've been held in Gaza, that's it's so sad and frightening. And we know several people, family members. So freedom for the hostages. I think that's something we can all rally around. But also that Hamas and this ideology would be eliminated. Now we could want them to be eliminated as a terrorist organization, but like Miles just shared, it's an ideology, right? So first, we'd like the terrorist organization with the guns and the rockets to stop and be removed. But then, we have a problem in Arab countries when you eliminate a terrorist organization. Who fills the vacuum of power? Jesus talks about this. If the demons are cast out of a man, and then they return and they see it's all swept up in order, they come back and they fill it with 7 demons. So you have that same problem that happens. So when we talk about a true solution, yes, we're asking for justice. We're praying that this terrorist organization that harms both Israelis and Palestinians would be eliminated, but also that God would raise up true leaders and shepherds for the Palestinians that would govern truthfully in righteousness. We're praying that this war would not escalate, but if it does escalate, that there would be protection, because for Israel to fight a war on one front is one thing. I know right now Israel looks like the aggressor and the military power right now, but when you have over 20 Arab states around you, all of a sudden we start looking very small in the light of what's happening around here. I'm really praying that bitterness and hatred would not creep in. It's very challenging. I mean, you got to think some of these people have an Arab Palestinian gardener from Gaza that has a work permit to work in Israel. They've been their gardener for 10 years. And then we find out that Hamas used these gardeners, these Arab workers, to get intel into the homes that had money, where the children are, where they were vulnerable. So just imagine you're a Jew that loved Arabs, and then all of a sudden you find out that your gardener that you had a relationship with, that you loved, that you knew by name, informed Hamas where to kill your child. How does that not turn into hatred? And the only thing I know that can heal that is the power of the love of Yeshua. Mm-hmm. The only thing I know. So we have the antidote. We've been given the message of reconciliation. And so I think for us as Jewish believers and Arab believers in the country to showcase that in the coming days, months, weeks, and years, it's going to be very, very critical. So that would be peace in the hearts. And then also I would pray that we're praying for our military, and I know that might be controversial, but pray for our military because these are our sons and our daughters. We have one of our team members who's going in and out of Gaza. We have staff members on our team that have multiple kids and brothers and sisters serving on the front lines. These are young people, and they're wanting to stand up for their country. We're just praying safety, protection, and also that God would use us as a light at this time. I think that's the last thing I would just say is. So many of you have invested into our emergency crisis fund, but we're seeing more opportunities for ministry now than ever before. Things we never thought possible. People that never used to work with us because we're believers. Now that there's a crisis where the need is so great, that they say, we don't care. We love that you're here. Thank you. And I'm seeing gospel ministry in Israel accelerate in what would have taken decades in only a matter of weeks. And so that would be that we would really, even though we're a small body, that we would adequately shine God's light and bring hope and healing to hearts and minds. We're not going to provide the military solution. We're not going to provide the political solution, but we can provide hope and healing to hearts and minds of those who had everything ripped away from them. And that would be how I would be praying in a gospel-centered way right now.
And Casey actually just put some more prayer points in the chat there that our team put together. Nancy and Diane, I know you have more questions, but we want to respect everyone's time. So we are going to wrap it up for now, but we'd love for you to just let us know your questions personally, because we're in touch with both of you, and we would love to maybe do this again, or find another way to communicate and help really give a little bit more of an insight. And so we're grateful that you guys have taken just a little bit of time to be with us today, and that we've been able to really kind of dive in a little bit deeper, not in a public setting. And so continue to let us know if this stirs anything inside of you, have any more questions or more thoughts, and ways that we can help better explain or digest what's going on. We are happy to do so. We want to be able to provide that for you as you lead so many people all around the world. So thanks again so much for being with us. We are so grateful for each of you, and we're sending you lots of love.
Will you all be doing this again or no?
I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully, we're gonna have more spaces like this for sure. We're trying to find the best way to do this. But Chris, I'm gonna post my email in here for anyone as well, just so you can have my information directly. Would love to be in touch. And I'll say this: we're here in Israel, and I know that might be difficult, but I actually feel like in many ways our job right now is easier than your job, which is to pastor and lead people right now that are not living here. All you're receiving is news in the headlines. So we want to help in any way that we can, you guys to navigate through this.
Okay.
So thanks for your time today. Thank you for making the time, and we'll send out this recording as well, and happy to answer more questions as we go.
Yes. Thank you guys.
Okay.
Thanks, you guys.
Everyone have a good day.
Bye.